welcome back to the deep dive. You guys sent in some seriously interesting articles about, new developments in the whole COVID-19 origin story. And let me tell you, this deep dive is going to be a wild one.
Yeah, it seems like that question, did it come from nature or from a lab? It's back in the spotlight. You've got these intelligence agencies, and their new assessments could totally change how we think about this whole debate.
Definitely. We're going to be focusing mostly on a report from Arab News, all about a statement from the CIA. But we'll also be checking out some other news from around the world that caught our attention. So, okay, let's break this down. The Arab News article, it says that the CIA now thinks it's more likely that COVID-19 came from a lab, not from nature. But this seems kind of different from what they were saying before, right? Like they used to say they couldn't really figure out where the pandemic started. So what does this new assessment even mean? And should we be taking it super seriously?
Oh, it's a big shift for sure. Even though the CIA is basing this on what they're calling low confidence, it does tell us that the intelligence community is thinking differently now. But it's important to remember that both possibilities are still, on the table. We could be talking natural origin. We could be talking lab leak.
So not a done deal then, but definitely something to watch. The article also mentions former CIA Director William Burns and how he's pushing for a clear answer because, this pandemic is such a huge historical event years later, and he still wants to know what happened. Why do you think that is? Especially with all the political stuff that gets stirred up with this issue.
That's a really good question. See, for someone like Burns, this goes beyond just science, right? It's about, accountability, making sure something like this doesn't happen again. If we never get a clear answer, it could send the wrong message. It could be like saying it's okay for countries to hide stuff when there's a potential outbreak.
And transparency has been, a bit of an issue this whole time, hasn't it?
Yeah.
The article also brings up China's take on all this, saying that the U.S. is just trying to make this political.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation geopolitically speaking. China's government, they're sticking to their guns. Lab leak. Not likely, they say. And they say the U.S. is just using this whole investigation to score political points. It makes you really think about all the information that's out there, who's saying what, and what their agenda might be.
Right, like we have to be careful about biases and motivations, especially with something as sensitive as this. Speaking of sensitive, the article mentions John Ratcliffe. He was the director of national intelligence, and he straight up says he believes the virus came from a leak at that Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Oh yeah, Ratcliffe's statement definitely adds another wrinkle to everything. He seems pretty sure of himself, but he's not in office anymore, so what's he basing this on? That's the question.
I was just thinking that. More transparency about the evidence, like how they came to these conclusions, that would help everyone understand what's going on, right?
Totally. Transparency is crucial, especially for something this big and this sensitive. If we don't have it, how can we trust anything? How can we all be on the same page?
That's a good point. Seems like we're dealing with a lot of unknowns here, which honestly just makes this deep dive even more interesting, wouldn't you say?
It's like a puzzle, but we're missing pieces. We might never find them all. But by looking at what we do have, we can at least try to make some sense of things.
Right, exactly. The point isn't to have all the answers right now, but to really explore this whole thing and get you thinking critically about everything you're hearing, right?
It's about asking the right questions, considering all sides, and being open to new information as it comes out. Even with this shift towards the lab leak idea, the CIA still says both scenarios are possible. That's important to keep in mind. Headlines can be really catchy, but remember, this isn't about being 100% certain, it's about probabilities.
A good reminder that it's okay to not know everything. What matters is that we keep searching, keep investigating, and talk about it openly and honestly.
Totally agree. This is already shaping up to be a really thought-provoking deep dive, and I'm excited to see where it takes us.
Me too. So much more to unpack. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, the Arab News article also pointed out some other interesting news happening around the world. There was one about a mysterious illness. People are dying from it in Kashmir, the part that's administered by India. And it might be caused by a toxin, not an infection.
Interesting. Too early to say if it's related to what we're talking about, but it does raise a good point. Whether something's natural or man-made, we got to understand where these health crises come from if we want to stop them from happening again. It's like a reminder that we're always learning and figuring out how to deal with new challenges in public health.
Yeah, and it shows how important global cooperation and transparency are when we're facing these kinds of challenges.
Absolutely. We got to be able to share information and resources if we want to fight these emerging health threats, no matter where they start.
We also saw some news about Elon Musk speaking at this German far-right rally, a new U.S. defense secretary getting sworn in, and some big cleanup efforts after an oil spill in Russia. It feels like all these headlines together, they're like a snapshot of the world right now. Public health, politics, technology, the environment, it's all connected.
It's a good reminder that while we're trying to figure out where COVID-19 came from, the world's still moving. You've got all these other big events happening, and they can have a big impact. They might seem totally separate at first, but these issues, they all kind of play off each other in ways we might not expect.
That's true. Good reminder to stay curious and pay attention to what's going on in the world.
For sure. Now, getting back to that CIA assessment for a sec, if this lab leak theory really starts to gain momentum, it could shake things up internationally, in terms of relations between countries and even scientific research.
Oh, good point.
Yeah.
What do you see happening?
Well, labs around the world could suddenly be under a microscope. People will be looking at their safety protocols, which could even affect how countries work together on research. And, there might be more pressure on China to be more transparent about what was happening in those early days of the pandemic.
Wow. Yeah, whole web of consequences.
Definitely. And it makes you think about how this could change public opinion and trust in science and scientists.
That's a big one. I mean, people's trust in science has been a little rocky lately, and this might just make things worse.
It's really important that we have open and honest discussions about all this. We got to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers and that things are complicated.
I agree, 100%. It's about talking to each other, not pointing fingers and blaming each other.
Right. This new information from the CIA, it's like adding fuel to a fire, but we need to be smart about it. Think critically and consider every angle.
This deep dive is already making me think in ways I didn't expect. I can't wait to dig even deeper into these articles and see what else we can learn.
Me too. There's so much to unpack here.
We'll be back in part 2 to keep exploring all this. Stay tuned.
And we're back for part 2 of our deep dive, folks. Still digging into the latest on the origins of COVID-19,
Yeah, picking up where we left off, still thinking about how the CIA's assessment, the one where they're leaning toward the lab leak, how that might affect things globally. It's interesting, though, even with this shift, they're still saying it's low confidence, right?
Right, exactly. It's like one piece of a much bigger puzzle, not the whole picture or anything. We got to be careful not to jump to conclusions or get caught up in speculation. And, things are always changing. What we think we know today could be totally different tomorrow, especially if new evidence pops up.
Definitely feels like this whole deep dive is really showing us how important it is to think for ourselves and not just take everything we hear at face value. Oh, speaking of new information, the Arab News article mentioned John Ratcliffe, the former director of national intelligence. Remember him? He's saying he thinks the virus came from a leak at that Wuhan Institute of Virology. He seems pretty sure about it.
Yeah, Ratcliffe has been pretty vocal about his suspicions regarding a lab leak for a while now. His statement definitely adds another layer to the whole discussion. But, we have to consider, why is he saying this? Are there any biases we need to be aware of? Like we talked about earlier, there's a whole geopolitical angle to this, right? China's pushing back hard against the lab leak theory, saying the U.S. is just trying to make them look bad.
So it's not just science, it's politics, too. And, all these investigations could have the big impact on how countries get along with each other.
Exactly. And it brings up some big questions about transparency and trust. Like, are investigators actually getting all the information they need? And how can we be sure that whatever they find is, objective and not influenced by politics?
Those are really important questions.
Yeah.
We need a process that's transparent and accountable so that people can trust the findings no matter what they are.
Couldn't agree more. That's where international collaboration comes in. Ideally, we need scientists and experts from all over the world working together to investigate this properly. No one country calling the shots.
A global team effort would definitely help reduce bias and make the findings more credible. People would be more likely to accept the results if they knew it was a joint effort.
Exactly. It would show that everyone's committed to finding the truth, putting science first. It's actually encouraging to see that even with all the political stuff going on, people are still pushing for this kind of approach. Science-based and collaborative.
Yeah, amidst all the chaos and finger-pointing, it's good to know there are still voices calling for a level-headed approach.
Yeah.
Focusing on getting to the truth, not just pushing an agenda.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, that's what we should all want. Not to be right, but to understand what happened and why, so we can prevent it from happening again.
Well said. This deep dive is really highlighting how important it is to think critically and be willing to engage with complex issues in a thoughtful way.
You got it. It's a reminder that even when we're talking about stuff that can be really sensitive and divisive, respectful dialogue and a shared commitment to finding the truth are super important.
Definitely. It's about approaching these things with curiosity and an open mind, recognizing that there's often a lot more to the story than what we see on the surface.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating, right? We're not just looking at the facts, but all the subtleties, the things we're not sure about, and the different perspectives that shape how we see the world.
It's like a journey,
Mhm.
you know. The Arab News article also mentioned that the CIA's assessment got, well, mixed reactions. Some experts are skeptical, while others are saying we need to investigate more.
That's bound to happen with something this complicated. There are always going to be different opinions and interpretations, especially when it comes to evidence.
Yeah, and it's important to listen to those different viewpoints. It's not about ignoring the people who disagree, but talking to them in a constructive and respectful way.
Exactly. We can learn from people who see things differently. It's through that back and forth, the questioning and examining the evidence, that we get closer to the truth.
It makes me think of that Carl Sagan quote, the one about extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The idea that COVID-19 came from a lab, that's a pretty big claim. So the evidence better be solid.
Oh, that's a good one. And totally relevant to our deep dive here. We need to be skeptical, but also open to the possibility that the evidence might point to a lab leak. It's about finding that balance between being critical and open-minded.
It's interesting, the timing of this new assessment from the CIA. It's been years since the pandemic started, and now all of a sudden, there's this renewed focus on China and their role in those early days.
That's an interesting observation. The timing is definitely curious. It could be that the political climate has changed, or maybe there's new information that's made the CIA rethink things.
It would be really interesting to know if there is new evidence and what it is. Transparency on that would go a long way in terms of building trust.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot about, what if it was a lab leak, but what if the virus actually did come from nature? What do we learn then? What are the key takeaways?
That's a great question. If it wasn't a lab, what does that tell us?
It means we need to keep a closer eye on these zoonotic diseases, the ones that can jump from animals to humans. It shows how connected human health and animal health really are. It's not just about us, it's about the whole ecosystem.
So understanding that connection is key. What else?
It also means we need to be better prepared for future outbreaks, no matter where they come from. Strong public health systems are essential for everyone.
So even if there wasn't a lab leak, there are still valuable lessons to learn from COVID-19. We could use those lessons to be more prepared for the next health crisis.
Exactly. It's about being resilient, working together globally, and taking action before things get out of control.
This deep dive is really showing how much responsibility we all have, to learn from what happened and prevent something like this from happening again, regardless of how it started.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's about focusing on solutions, working together, and protecting everyone's health worldwide. That's what matters.
Feels like we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the CIA's new assessment, explored the lab leak and natural origin scenarios, and really emphasized how important critical thinking is and nuanced understanding and a collaborative approach.
And we touched on the whole geopolitical situation, how complicated it is, and how important transparency and trust are.
Yeah, so much to unpack, and I feel like we're just scratching the surface here.
For sure. But it's a good foundation for understanding this whole story, which is still developing and changing all the time.
I'm excited to see what other insights we can uncover as we keep digging.
Me too. There's so much more to explore. We're just getting started.
We'll be right back after a quick break. And we're back. Final part of our deep dive into the origins of COVID-19. We've gone over a lot, from that new CIA assessment and what it could mean globally, to the whole geopolitical side of things, and of course the lab leak versus natural origin theories.
Yeah, and through it all, we've been saying how important it is to, think for ourselves, be open to different ideas, and work together to figure this out. It's complicated.
It really is. So I'm wondering, with this new info from the CIA, how do you think it'll affect how people see science and scientists? There's already been so much talk about trust in science and expertise, and this feels like you could add another layer to that.
Oh, for sure. It's a big question. And honestly, this new development, it might make things even more, messy.
Really? How so?
Well, think about it. If more and more people start to believe the lab leak theory, they might start thinking that, scientists were hiding something or not being totally honest, and that could really damage trust.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, this pandemic changed everything. It makes sense that people would be suspicious, especially if they feel like they haven't been getting the whole story.
Right, exactly. This whole situation shows how important it is for scientists and institutions to be open and honest with the public.
So how can they do that? What
Yeah.
can they do to rebuild that trust and address these concerns?
I think it comes down to communication. Scientists need to talk to people in a way that's, straightforward, easy to understand, and honest. They got to explain how research works, admit when they're not sure about something, and be clear about the potential risks and limitations.
Transparency is key, right? People need to feel like they're getting the information and that they can trust where it's coming from.
Exactly. And it's not just about the facts, it's also about showing empathy. Scientists need to understand that people are worried and anxious, and they need to acknowledge that.
Yeah, it's about building relationships, having conversations where everyone feels respected and heard.
Well said. This whole thing also highlights how important it is for everyone to understand science, to have those
Yeah.
critical thinking skills.
Right, because if people understand how science works, they're less likely to fall for misinformation or, jump to conclusions based on incomplete information.
That's it. It's about giving people the tools to evaluate the evidence, question what they're hearing, and form their own opinions based on facts.
So this deep dive, it's not just about where COVID-19 came from. It's about trust in science and making sure everyone has the information they need to make sense of it all.
You got it. It reminds us that science is a process. It's not about having all the answers right now. And that process has to be transparent, accountable, and open to discussion.
The Arab News article also mentioned a few other things that caught my attention.
Mm-hmm.
There was that story about the strange illness in Kashmir, the part administered by India. They think it might be a toxin, not an infection.
I saw that too. And yeah, it's not related to COVID-19, but it shows us that we can't let our guard down. New health threats can pop up anytime, anywhere.
The world's constantly changing, and we got to be ready for whatever comes next.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we need strong public health systems everywhere, global cooperation, and a willingness to keep learning and adapting as we go.
Couldn't agree more. There was also some news about Elon Musk at that German far-right rally, the new U.S. Defense Secretary, and that oil spill cleanup in Russia. All these different stories, they really show how connected everything is.
It's a good reminder that while we're focused on COVID-19, other stuff is happening all over the world, things that could have a big impact down the line. It's easy to think of these issues as separate, but they all influence each other in ways we might not realize.
Well, after this deep dive, what are your final thoughts? Do you think this new assessment from the CIA changes everything? Or does it just give us more questions than answers?
Even with this shift toward the lab leak theory, the truth is we might never know for sure where COVID-19 came from. And that's okay. This deep dive, it reminds us that things are always changing, information is always evolving, and we have to think critically about everything. We have to stay curious, keep asking questions, and be open to different perspectives.
I couldn't have said it better myself. That's what the deep dive is all about. We hope this episode has given you some things to think about and inspired you to keep learning and exploring this complex issue. Thanks for joining us, and remember, keep asking those questions, keep digging deeper, and never stop learning.